From WFCR, Four College Radio in Amherst, Massachusetts, the Eastern Educational Radio Network presents Four College Lecture Hall, a weekly program of outstanding talks by faculty members and guests at Amherst, Mount Holyoke, and Smith Colleges and the University of Massachusetts. Today's guest is Professor B.F. Skinner of Harvard University, a leading behavioral psychologist. Professor Skinner is author of several books, including Science and Human Behavior and Walden II. At this lecture, delivered on October 21st at Amherst College, Professor Skinner discusses planning experimental communities.
There is, of course, as these meetings of the forum indicate, a great interest currently in utopias. Conferences are held, courses are given, books are written, and why this should be so will depend largely upon your interpretation of what utopian thinking is all about. Just last week, I got a reprint from two psychoanalysts who defined utopian dreaming in the following way. When in need of and in despair for the absent breast, the infant hallucinates the fulfillment and thus postpones momentarily the overwhelming panic of prolonged frustration. This is utopian dreaming at an early age, and if that is the case, one would suppose that the current interest might reflect either too much bottle feeding or something wrong in the design of bottles. It's possible also that at the other extreme that this may reflect the only remaining mode in which young people today can think politically without danger of future recriminations. This is a way of talking about communism with a small c, a kind of domestic Peace Corps activity and so on. Whatever the reason, the fact is that there's a great deal of talk about communities. And also, there happens to be a great deal of talk of a critical sort. There are lots of discussions of dystopias or cacotopias. Karl Popper's book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, anticipated some of this. The best modern utopias happen to be satires. Huxley's Brave New World is one, and Orwell's 1984 another. And Professor Kateb, in his book Utopia and Its Enemies, the title patterned obviously on Popper, discusses the current concern for rejecting the good life, rejecting utopian thought. Now, I got into this myself quite innocently. I wrote Walden II seriously. Many people have thought I might have had tongue-in-cheek, but that's not the case. I pictured in it what I thought was a good life. If you look at it closely, you'll see that I was enamored of the 19th century country life in England as portrayed by Trollope and people like that, but I wanted to arrange it somehow or other and avoid the servant problem. But if you do that, you come up with something very close to Walden II. Here is a community of about 1,000 people, semi-isolated but contemporary. It isn't off in some distant island or remote period of time. They're engaging in pleasant, productive work. The hours are short. There certainly is no compulsion. Child care is excellent in the hands of specialists. Education is carefully designed for the life which everyone is going to lead in the community. It includes emotional and social education as well. Living conditions are healthful, good medical care. Social contacts are maximized, but privacy is absolutely guaranteed. Plenty of leisure and all sorts of ways of using it. The arts and music flourish. Science is encouraged, particularly the all-important behavioral science and so on. It seemed to me a very important way to work out a good life and perfectly feasible. I thought at the time I wrote it that the behavioral technology, and that's 20 years ago, by the way, that the technology available at the time would make something like that quite possible. And in these 20 years, changes have come about in what we know about human behavior, so that it seems to me even more likely today to be within the realm of the possible. And others think so too. I'm happy to say sales continue to rise, and hundreds of readers write to me every year wanting to join or at least to find out whether there isn't something like a Walden II, and if not, why not? So this seemed to me to be an instance in which a way of life had been described, not only attractive, but feasible. And to my very real surprise, it was violently attacked. Life magazine wrote an editorial calling it a slander on some old notions of the good life, such a triumph of mort main, or the dead hand, as has not been envisaged since the days of Sparta, a slur upon a name, a corruption of an impulse. The two authors, Nagley and Patrick, in their book Quest for Utopia, speak of the shocking horror of the idea. And Joseph Wood Crouch, a distinguished critic, devotes the better part of a book, The Measure of Man, to what he calls my ignoble utopia. There's a curious violence in all this. People have made critical comments about utopias in the past. One of Plato's characters calls his republic a city of pigs, but never before have utopias stirred up this kind of storm. Now, why should this be? Possibly the answer may be that utopias now are beginning to seem within reach. This was the argument of the Russian critic Berdyaev, who argued that the problem now is not how to achieve utopia, but how to prevent it. And as a matter of fact, Fortune magazine, which reviewed Walden II fairly favorably, one loose publication not knowing what the other is up to, made this point, that this could be realized, but we better watch it. Now, we are accustomed to seeing utopian schemes come true. Most of the things that we boast of as accomplishments today were once pictured in that particular branch of science fiction called utopian writing. And so we have to face the fact that this is no longer some speculative possibility. Perhaps it will be here soon, and why is it then that we don't like it? I think in order to answer that, we ought to look a bit at the various ways in which people have proposed to achieve the good life and see whether there's something about current possibilities which make the whole idea objectionable. It all begins, of course, as so much does, with Plato and the Republic. Plato knew very little about ways of life. He had before him only a single example, the Greek city-state, and that's what he pictured, an improved city-state. He had some idea as to what would improve it. For example, he's going to throw out religion and all the drama and the poets and so on. But in general, his only sure recipe was to find someone who really knew how to govern. This is an old trick. If you don't know how to do something, you imagine there's someone who does and put him in charge. And the philosopher king served that function. If the Republic got into trouble, the philosopher king would find out what was wrong and put it right. Today, of course, the Republic is regarded as a totalitarian pattern. It's a closed society. It was actually almost tried. The Emperor Gallienus, the Roman emperor, was on the point of giving a captured city to the philosopher Plotinus so that he might try Plato's Republic. But Gallienus was called away by emergencies of state, and Plotinus never had his chance, probably luckily for him. We have, as a matter of fact, a little bit of the Republic left. As a matter of fact, in the middle of the 18th century, a French city planner and architect drew up a city plan for the Republic, and it was a student of his, Pierre L'Enfant, whom Washington called in to design the city of Washington, D.C., and he did, and there it is. So, to some extent, we're all living in a utopia, namely Plato's Republic. Now, there are those who think that the next utopian dream should be identified as the Christian heaven. This is St. Augustine in the City of God. Here is a way of life founded on the highest authority, a pattern of the perfect life. But curiously enough, no one has ever really been able to imagine a satisfactory heaven. It's bad enough to plan a utopia, as I've tried to do, for one lifetime, but what do you do for a whole eternity? What are people going to be doing all that time? And if you simply say people are going to be happy because that will be God's will, they will be made eternally happy, as they might with some psychedelic drug, for example, that might be the solution. By fiat, everyone is defined as happy, and that's the end of it. But the actual way of life that would make people happy has never been clearly drawn up, and Augustine himself couldn't do it. He could write The City of God, but when he came to drawing up the rules for monastic living, the life that he arranged was anything but fulfilling. It was temporizing. It got you through this world and cozily into the next. But it was the next which was to be really utopian in nature. Now, Plato was arguing sub homine, if I may use the classical expression. He was going to govern by men, government under man. St. Augustine was sub Deo, under God. But by the time that Thomas More started to write a utopia and gave that name to the whole genre, there was a new principle which had emerged, and that was improved governmental structure, something like a constitutional government on the English pattern, law, order, appeal to reason. And Francis Bacon, who followed More within a century, being a lawyer, took this theme up. Here was to be an ordered society with order enforced, it is true, but well designed so that reason would prevail. We would design a way of life and make sure that people lived it. A rational constitution in accord with human nature, which would provide for an effective government. That was the theme, essentially, of utopian thinking of, let us say, the 16th and 17th centuries. Reason, however, can go too far. And it was More's friend Erasmus who first pointed this out in a rather whimsical way. His book, The Praise of Folly, actually begins with a pun on More's name. The root More in Latin means fool or folly. And I suppose Erasmus was having a little fun with his friend in pointing this out. But he makes a very important point, though, in showing that if it were not for what we call folly, reason wouldn't have a chance. We wouldn't be alive if it weren't for the folly of the appetite. We wouldn't have been born if it weren't for the folly of sex, and so on. So that before you are able to apply constitutional government and create a well-designed way of life, make sure that you're here and alive, and to do that you ought to encourage a little folly. Now, that received support very quickly and in a surprising way from world travelers who for the first time were going around the world and couldn't miss Tahiti. And for sailors cooped up on sailing ships for months, Tahiti certainly looked like the good life. And curiously enough, it didn't have any law and order, it didn't have any government. Nothing that resembled Western civilization could be detected there at all. So suddenly the whole notion of a good life through civilization crumbled. Why could people be so happy without civilization if that was what was going to make us all happy? And this led, of course, in the century which followed, to Rousseau's notion of the noble savage, to Diderot's very amusing dialogue between a Catholic priest and a Tahitian chief, in which Western morals come off very badly indeed. And it led after that to a whole spate of utopias written on the South Sea Idyll principle. Beautiful ways of life were described, which people were very happy, friendly, lovers, and everything went very well. This went on into the 19th century. Even as late as 1850, a French utopian, Etienne Cabet, wrote a book, Voyage en Icarie, along the South Sea line. Here was a picture of an idyllic way of life. And why was it that way? Well, the people were naturally good. If you could only get rid of government, they would emerge and we would all be happy. Cabet, as a matter of fact, tried it out. He sent 1,500 people to America. They were headed for the Red River in Texas, and they were going to set up this idyllic existence there. Cabet followed the following year, but dissension arose, as you might expect. He went with a few people toward Texas, but got only as far as St. Louis, where he died. I was in St. Louis recently and tried to find out whether anyone there knew whether he was buried there or had ever heard of him. No one seemed to have heard of him. You get a little of this South Sea sort of thing today in the philosophies of the beats, the rebels, and so on. The extreme permissiveness as a solution, Summerhill as a solution to education, and so on. The anarchistic pattern that if you can get rid of government, things will be fine. And this, of course, was the utopia that Marx opposed. We think of Marx as a utopian in many ways, but he called himself an anti-utopian just for the simple reason that those utopias were described without any recipe as to how one would achieve them. How are you going to build this better world? Just trusting to the natural goodness of man was by no means enough. Now Marx's own solution, moving on away from sub homine sub deo sub lege, was of course economic. And this had already been foreshadowed by many early writers. Diderot himself, who had so much fun with the Tahitians' theory of morals, looked into this whole question of whether man could not be made happy through the production of wealth. He had a very simple and what seemed like a very natural argument that if you only showed people how to create wealth, they'd start creating it, and we'd all be wealthy, healthy, and wise. And in his great encyclopedia, which is a marvelous work, he revealed for the first time for everyone to see all kinds of secrets, trade secrets, which are family secrets, guild secrets, and so on. And by looking at the encyclopedia, you can find out how to mine coal, how to quarry stone, how to make paper, how to make silver plate, and whatnot. And I think he really believed that once people knew how to be wealthy, produce wealth, they would do so, and that would be that. And as a matter of fact, Marx didn't get very much beyond that. He thought he detected the reason why people weren't doing it in the sequestering of the means, the materials needed for production, but he actually never solved the main problem, which is one of incentive. Adam Smith and all the others could explain why with profits the entrepreneur would indeed engage in various undertakings. But why the ordinary man would work in the industrial system of the 19th century was a question no one really answered. The utopians argued that man was possessed of a compulsion to work. And William Morris has a utopia called News from Nowhere, in which people are out looking for work, not to make money. They don't need money, but they just want to work. They've got this compulsion. It's an uneasiness. They're trying to find work. And that is why we will all work, why we will all produce wealth, why we will all be happy. And of course, the utopia of the 19th century on the economic principle, the best known, is Bellamy's Looking Backward, in which everything it seems to be worked out well in Boston in the not now too distant future, partly, for example, through what one might call a nationalized Sears Roebuck. Just simply, everything is available, and hence people are happy. There's something quite wrong with that. It's what is wrong in the Marxist principle of to each according to his need and from each according to his ability. How do you get from each according to his ability, and what happens when you give to each according to his need? Now, what happens when each gets what he needs, whether it's in a beneficent South Sea island or in a welfare state, is that he goes to sleep. This is the Candy Mountain land, the cocaine, where everyone has all he needs and is happy simply because he is in a position to consume indefinitely. But as you all know, consumption doesn't take very much time. Consummatory activities are not a large part of the day, and the rest of the time can be terribly boring. The question is, how can you make use of the goods which are now available because of production in order to make people happy? You can't do it simply by giving them these things. This doesn't work in the South Seas. They may be happy temporarily, but they aren't doing very much, and it doesn't work in the welfare state. Now, how to make people active, how to make them productive, how to make them creative, and so on, raises an issue that is not covered by government by a sub homine remedial philosopher king, or even sub deo. It involves something which is important, and important to me because I happen to be interested in it professionally. It involves something about human behavior. Not only productive activity, but social activities, education, the use of leisure. All of this is something which has never been properly covered by earlier utopias because they weren't dealing with the proper variables. They weren't talking about the conditions under which people do live happy, active lives. Now, the two best-known figures in behavioral science in the 20th century have never figured very prominently in utopian writing. Freud is the first of these, and there is, so far as I know, no explicit Freudian utopia. There are Freudian books which discuss principles that might be applied to the design of a good life, but no one, so far as I know, has written an actual description of a society organized on Freudian principles. The other figure of the century, Pavlov, got into it quite by accident. He happened accidentally to be Russian. And when the Russians revolted and set up their own communist form of government in 1917, they very quickly chose Pavlov as one of their gods because it seemed to fit their purposes. He talked about the modifiability of behavior, the importance of the environment, and they could then argue that if the current Russian was an unhappy, miserable wretch, it was only because of the unhappy and unfortunate environment in which he had lived, and that if they could only change that environment as they now could, a very different kind of person would result. By the 30s, this became a little embarrassing because the government had had a chance to change the environment for 15 years, say, and nothing very much had yet happened to people. So they dropped Pavlov completely, and he only came back into favor when, at the end of the Second World War, the Russians could take certain pride in what they had done and could then begin again to claim that they had done it by the construction of their own type of environment. But Pavlov got into it partly because the best satirical utopia of the century is Huxley's Brave New World, which made quite a good deal of the principle of conditioning. You remember there was the center where people, after being decanted from their bottles in which they gestated, were shaped behaviorally for the world which lay before them. There was one level of person, the deltas, rather low down on the social scale, where it was important that for their own happiness and for the integration of the community, they should take no interest in literature or nature. And as you remember, this was done by putting the babies on the floor in the room, along one edge of which were arranged attractive books and bouquets. And the children naturally crawl toward these objects, reach out and touch them, whereupon they're shocked electrically through the floor. They pull back, reach out again, and are shocked. And after 3 or 4 of these exposures, they lose all interest in literature and nature and are now appropriately conditioned for the role they are to play in this brave new world. Now, that looks Pavlovian. Actually, it's much older than Pavlov. We do this all the time. We buy attractive objets d'art, fancy breakable ashtrays, little vases, and so on. We put them on low coffee tables. We put babies on the floor. And then when the babies reach, we crack their knuckles. Now, there's not a great deal of difference between cracking a knuckle and shocking, and if you really want to be scientific, you can now buy these small electric probes which can be used. This is also true of the other principles in Brave New World. There was a great deal there about economics. You had to engage in sports that required a lot of equipment so that factories would be busy turning out the equipment and so on. This was just early Keynesian Rooseveltian economics. There is, of course, the use of soma, an emotion surrogate drug. You'll hear more about that or something very much like it in the not-too-distant future. These, however, are old. Alcohol is the earliest of these drugs, but everything from betel nut to mescaline and so on have been employed for this purpose for a long time. It didn't take any behavioral science, certainly, to turn that kind of thing up. And I think Huxley himself knew this. He calls his book A Brave New World. And that's, of course, taken from The Tempest, in which Miranda exclaims when she sees these handsome young creatures who've just arrived on the island, "Oh, brave new world that has such creatures in it." But these people were from contemporary Italy. They were of this world, and nothing about the new world, nothing about the future at all. And the French title, Le Meilleur des Mondes, taken from Pangloss's misuse of Leibniz's phrase, the best of all possible worlds. Pangloss was talking about this world. And I think that Huxley knew he was too. I think he had his tongue in his cheek when he claimed later on that he was surprised to see how rapidly Brave New World was coming true. Now, to some extent, one could say of Walden too, which I think is based on better behavioral principles, that it too isn't very new. As a matter of fact, this was brought home to me in a rather shocking way a few years ago, and a friend of mine came in and said, "I hear that you are thinking about starting a Walden II. You're going to get into trouble. It's going to be called communism, and I've come in to tell you how you can avoid that problem. You say in your book that anyone who's lived in Walden II and grows old and is no longer productive still has the right to live there, to eat, have housing, clothing, and so on, to enjoy all the privileges." I said, "Don't say that. Say you have your own Social Security." And he might have added Medicare. "You have health and doctors free. You walk in and get health service and whatnot and don't pay anything at all." Don't say that. Say you have your own Blue Cross Blue Shield. Now, it doesn't matter about the schools being free or even the universities. That's not communistic. But when you say that they can go into a dining room and eat and walk out without paying, or go to a clothing room and get what they need to wear and so on, don't do that. Keep books. Find out how much everyone earns per year and how much he spends. And then at the end of every year, you tote these things up and make a comparison. And if the member of Walden II has consumed more than he's earned, you put him through voluntary bankruptcy. But if, on the other hand, he has earned more than he's consumed, you confiscate it as income tax. Now, this worried me for a while, because I thought, well, perhaps we have already reached Walden II, and nothing is needed except a slight little remedial change here and there. But I think there is something very different involved in the implications of modern behavioral science for the design of a way of life. And while I think it is promising, it is, I think, also clearly the thing which is causing trouble and makes people, outrages people when they consider such a possibility. Over 2,000 or 3,000 years, and I have said I don't like to appeal to historical arguments, but I do use history, as everyone else does, when it suits my purposes. Over 2,000 or 3,000 years, I think you can see in the world a steady, or possibly not so steady, but a general drift from punitive techniques of control to what we now call positive reinforcement. Government is defined as the power to punish, but it has changed to some extent. We now use inducement as well as coercion. Religion has certainly changed from the wrathful God of the Old Testament to a God of love, from emphasis on hellfire to some kind of emphasis on heaven here or in the hereafter. In economics, we've changed from outright slavery to wages, and even to very special kinds of wages called incentive wages. Even in education, we are almost getting away from punitive techniques. Schoolboys have been flogged for 2,000 or 3,000 years, and they're still flogged occasionally. And where it isn't corporal, it's a much more effective kind of behavioral flogging. But efforts are being made. People are trying to find alternatives to the kind of threat which has been used in education in the past. We haven't got very far. Even though government has tried to turn to inducements, it runs into difficulties. In the 30s, the first big step in America in this direction was taken with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, where, when it was necessary to cut down production to get farmers to produce less, instead of making it illegal to produce 100% of what you produced last year, rather than 80%, farmers were paid for not producing the other 20%. This was a big change, because you could have simply made it illegal. There's too much food, it's illegal to produce food. But that wasn't what was done. But, as you know, this went through a great deal of argument about whether it was a constitutional thing or not. Finally, I think it now rests that the government is allowed to do this, but there are those who are uneasy about it. In religion, every once in a while someone still finds it necessary to remind the faithful that hell is a reality. In education, as you all know, a good deal of studying is still done just because you are afraid of the consequences of not studying. And in economics, wages are really not a very good example of positive reinforcement. A contract undercuts the motivating effect of reinforcers. When you're paid so much a month, all that money does is to establish a level, a standard of living from which you can be cut off by a boss if you don't turn up for work or work hard enough. Money is given to you, that's true, but it is not given as a reinforcer. It's not contingent on the behavior in the right way. It simply provides something, the loss of which can be used to threaten workers with. Now, it is possible to improve on this. It is possible to turn to effective positive reinforcement, to arrange those things which we all call goods, the things which are reinforcing to us, in such a way that they relate to our behavior and strengthen that behavior, make it more probable that we will behave in a given way again. This is what is wrong with to each according to his need. If you simply take the goods as effective in alleviating needs without asking what a man is doing when he gets what he needs, you've overlooked something very important. This is something which anyone skilled in reinforcement theory would not do. You must make sure that some behavior has occurred which is important to the welfare of the individual or the group when the goods are reached. Now, this is what naturally happens in the regular reinforcers of daily life. It is what tends to be overlooked in the contrived reinforcers which are set up by institutions, as in government, economics, education, and so on. The whole issue relates to value, and I think it reveals what is wrong with practically all theories of value. If someone asks you, what do you think is a good way of life? You will probably list the kinds of things that life will have for you. Food, sex, art, nature, and so on. You list a lot of reinforcers, to put it technically. You will not raise the question of what you do in getting those things. But no listing of goods in that sense will suffice to tell you whether a way of life is good or not. Because the South Sea idol and the welfare state, by definition, are an assortment of goods. But the thing which is missing is the human behavior which produces them. And when you ask that question, you change the whole value system. Some very interesting work is being done in Los Angeles by Dr. Lovis, who is working with autistic children. These are children who are hurting themselves seriously. They're eating their fingers off, for example. Now, he has had to break into that in order to get control of these children with positive reinforcement. He's had to use punishment. He's had to shock them, actually, to be frank with you. Then after he's done that, he uses the reinforcers of, let us say, candy or affection, personal affection, and so on, to build up good, satisfactory behavioral repertoires. So he uses shock and, let us say, affection. And he makes a very interesting point, that from naming those two things, personal affection and shock, you cannot deduce whether the person using them is being humane or not. It is, of course, inhumane to shock a child unless that works some change in his behavior which is for his benefit. A shock properly used is a humane act. On the contrary, most of these children have suffered from people who have misused affection. The child starts to chew more of his little finger off, and someone who's been told that all he lacks is love then goes over, throws his arms around him and so on, and reinforces him for having devoured part of himself. Well, now, by naming the good, which is affection in this case, you have not identified the value. It's the relation between what the child has done and what happens, which is the thing to watch. So that actually, a person who shocks children may be the humane person. A person who withholds affection until certain behaviors have occurred may be the humane person. And you can extend this to the whole notion of values and what is wrong when we try to picture a good life by listing the things we're going to get out of it. Because in doing that, we overlook the very important fact that we must be doing something when we get what we get in order to make that significant in building a way of life. If I were to write Walden 2 today, I would certainly emphasize that point much more than I did. I thoroughly neglected the contingencies of reinforcement which would make people happy. I assumed that they would be arranged, and I knew they would be powerful. But the book is not a good demonstration of the power of positive reinforcement as we understand it today. When it's properly used, this is an extraordinarily powerful instrument. And it can be used, and we are learning every day how to use it more effectively. And let's assume that it is going to be used well in designing a way of life. Why should we then fear the result? Under aversive techniques, when you have threatened people or punished them, you have people who may be unhappy about the way they're being treated, but they are likely to do something about it. You are forcing people to do what they do not want to do, and you give them an out. They can turn against you, they can counter-control you, they can revolt, and they will. And this has been, in part, the history of civilization. This very trend toward positive effects has been in the direction of getting away from aversive techniques that we don't like. When people use force on us, we may submit, but if we can gang up against them, we will. When people use positive techniques to trick us, to despoil us, we also turn on them and counter-control. But if you can conceive of a way of life which has been designed by someone who is properly using positive reinforcement, then everyone will be doing what he wants to do with no adverse consequences. Where then will the counter-control come from? does this not mean that the designer is in an absolute position, that he can do as he pleases? That is undoubtedly a possibility. Brainwashing is a technique of control which has prepared for counter-control and prevented it. And many people will argue that even something like programmed instruction is brainwashing because students like it and hence won't object to it. We're so accustomed to having them object to what we do that something seems wrong if they don't. But the fact is that people do object to positive control. The very complaints that I'm talking about tonight are signs of that. The violence with which this kind of design has been greeted is a form of counter-control. I don't think we need to worry that anyone is going to absorb these new techniques and run away with people in general. It's more than that. It's more than that this is a dangerous technique. We've had dangerous techniques, and we've worked out our solutions. Sheer brute force is a dangerous technique, but we've worked out counter-control. It's wrong to use force to control others, at least among our friends, not among nations. There is something more than that. We'll have to anticipate and prepare for counter-control of positive reinforcement, and I think that can be done. Another reason, though, why this prospective form of government is decried is that it seems to leave no role for the individual. Under punishing techniques, the individual still makes a contribution of his own. And we can admire him, we can give him credit for what he's done. We, in general, admire people when they do things which we don't understand. If we know why they are behaving, we don't admire them. In fact, we hold them demeaned or undignified. To be pushed around, to be jostled in a car over a rough road is undignified, unworthy. To be pushed around in a crowd is unworthy. The push is too obvious. To work out of fear of punishment is undignified because the control is too obvious. To work because of conspicuous bribes is undignified because the control is too obvious. We don't admire the Roman people for submitting to bread and circuses. But punitive techniques in general, since they are concerned with suppressing what we don't want people to do, leave always some unexplained sources of what people do. By punishing all the things we don't want to happen, we still leave it up to the individual to find those things which he can do and avoid punishment. I could go into this technically. There is actually a rather elaborate literature on how punishment works. But I think that's enough to state it just that way. That when governments, educational institutions, and so on, work by threatening people for misbehaving, they leave proper behavior up to the individual. But the alternative to this now is for the institution, economic, governmental, or what have you, to strengthen the positive behavior rather than to leave it as the last thing after you've punished everything else. And when this is the case, the individual himself can take no credit for it. Now the environment is determining what the individual will do. This is automatic goodness, and it appears that there is nothing in the world worse than to be automatically good. You may be just as good as if you were being coerced into it, but you're being good for the wrong reasons. When you punish a man for doing bad things, and he does good things, he can get credit. But when you induce him to do the good things, you get credit. The government gets the credit, the economic system gets the credit, and so on. There is nothing left for the man himself to claim. This is one of the big issues, that a government which is truly effective in producing the kinds of behavior which contribute to a good life must get the credit for that, and that leaves nothing to the individual. Personal responsibility is another term which permits us to talk about this. When you are under a punitive system, you are held responsible, and you are responsible in the sense that if you do not behave in certain ways, you can be justly punished. Under a system of positive reinforcement, the notion of personal responsibility has no meaning. There is nothing for which you are responsible. There is nothing for which you are to be held responsible. And it is the system which takes control and which is, in the last analysis, responsible for all you do. So that your very freedom, of course, is denied. Under a punitive system, you are free either to behave well or to behave badly and take the consequences. Under a positive system of positive reinforcement, it is clearly the environment which is controlling the behavior. There is no freedom and no dignity in such a system. The environment gets the credit. This is, however, not quite as bad as it may seem, because after all it is an environment which man himself has made. And man gets credit at least for that in some sense. Actually, if you analyze techniques of self-control, you can reduce them to ways in which people modify their own environments so that they behave in one way rather than another. In other words, you don't control yourself just by some exercise of willpower. You don't go just and behave the right way. You cajole yourself, you set up punitive sanctions and so on. In some way or other, you build a small world in which you behave in a given way. And that is a kind of self-control. You learn to do it from society so that even then you are not responsible for it. But man has, over the years, worked out better and better environments which make more of his behavior, which bring out more of his latent genetic endowment, which enable him to do things he couldn't do before. And it is a man-made environment. This is the way in which man, in the broadest sense, has actually contributed to his own future, controlled his own destiny. One argument is that if a science of behavior is right, then man has reached a dead end. That's Mr. Crouch's phrase. Man can no longer control his own destiny. He's been deprived of freedom, he's been deprived of responsibility. And any theory which attributes his conduct simply to his genetic endowment and to the world in which he lives deprives him of any chance to control his future. But the very fact is that man is always controlling his future because he is building the world in which he lives. And the geneticists tell us that before long he may even be building the germplasm, or at least modifying it. Through the evolution of human culture, science, and all of that, man is slowly maximizing his own productivity, his own fulfillment, the things he does, the things he enjoys, the things he needs to do in order to maintain the world which permits him to enjoy himself that way. This is one gigantic exercise in self-control, and that has meaning even within the framework of a science of behavior. So that the reasons for the violence seem not to be well taken. It is a form, positive reinforcement is a form of control, but we have had control before, and there's going to be nothing new that we shall have to set up counter controls, safeguards against the misuse of control. It may be that in the past we have given man credit for doing things because we couldn't understand why he did them, and now that we understand why he did them, we will be giving the credit to the things that led him to do them. But this, again, is not changing man himself. No theory of human behavior changes human behavior. It simply changes the ways in which we deal with it, and those have to be carefully examined if we are to use them well. There is very little to be said for our present laissez-faire way of designing the way in which we live. We accept a way of life as it comes to us from those who have existed before us, who've handed it on to us. It's very characteristic, especially in America, to examine practices, to examine physical technology, to see if there isn't a better way of doing something. And that, after all, is the essence of utopian thinking. It's just a question of whether or not we see really better ways of living, better ways of governing, better ways of teaching, and so on. And we will see those just as soon as we understand the full import of a science of behavior and a behavioral technology. What is needed is some understanding that we are actually learning important things about human behavior, and then a realization that what we learn in that way cannot help but bear upon our own thinking about the way we live and the changes we propose to make in it. A year or two ago, my wife and I went to Egypt. We went down to see Abu Simbel before it could conceivably be lost to the world. And the one thing you see in Egypt today, of course, is the dam and everything having to do with the dam. Here is a developing country, supposedly, who've called in technicians to change an important part of the life of the country, build a huge dam to change the Nile from the annual flooding type of thing to irrigation and so on. No one questions that. Here is a natural resource. Something can be done with it. Call in experts, happen to be Russian in that case, call in experts to do something about it. There is in Egypt a natural resource far more important than the Nile, but no one would think of calling in a technologist to deal with it. That's manpower. Enormous numbers, untold millions of Egyptians doing nothing. The contingencies of reinforcement just are not there. They're not productive. They're miserable. They're not educating themselves. They're not taking care of themselves physically. They're not producing. But who would think today of calling in someone, as one calls in the Russians in this case, to build a dam? The possibility of making that kind of change in a culture is just not examined. Now, as we come to understand what human behavior is, what causes it can be attributed to, how those causes can be manipulated, speaking very roughly now, then we can no longer overlook the necessary conclusion that a behavioral technology is to follow, and very soon, that it will have an enormous bearing upon the ways in which we live. All of our institutions are concerned with the creation of conditions affecting human life. And the more we know about the relation between those conditions and the behavior which is related to them, the sooner we will act positively to make changes in directions which will bring about changes in behavior which are important to us. How close are we to this? I wish I could say. This science that I'm talking about is a new science. It has generally been most effective in carefully controlled laboratory situations with one or two organisms, but these are getting bigger groups of people are now being examined and studied from a box with a rat or a pigeon or a person in it. We move to small groups. Then this is extended. A good deal of work is being done now with wards in hospitals for the retarded and hospitals for the psychotic. And of course, the retarded and the psychotic are a great deal more orderly as organisms and people in general, so it can be done there. But when these principles have been applied, the results have been fantastic. An entirely different kind of life can be created for people of that sort. Then you move on with normal human beings into the classroom and the redesign of a small classroom, let's say for small children. I visited this summer a camp organized on these principles, and it was the closest thing to Walden II I've ever seen. It was quite a surprising thing to me. I didn't think it could be done. The kind of thing which is going on in Job Corps camps and so on, these are beginning to offer opportunities to apply these principles on a broader basis. How far I can say we've come now, I would not undertake to say, but it looks to me very promising. It is moving in the direction from the simple to the complex, in the direction of applying principles which have been well validated first under controlled conditions to situations where something more needs to be taken for granted and there's a little more looseness in the application. But it's coming. It is moving in the direction of an explicit design of a way of life. And as I've said, this seems to me not to threaten anyone, but to be a venture in which man is actually beginning to control himself to build a better world which will build better men. Thank you very much.
On Fore College Lecture Hall today, you've heard a discussion of planning experimental communities by Professor B.F. Skinner, a leading behavioral psychologist at Harvard University. Professor Skinner is the author of several books, including Science and Human Behavior and Walden II. This lecture was recorded on October 21st, the first of a series of forum talks at Amherst College dealing with the general subject, Utopian Thought in America. The talk was presented today as part of the series Fore College Lecture Hall, a weekly program of outstanding talks by faculty members and guests at Amherst, Mount Holyoke, and Smith Colleges and the University of Massachusetts. This is the East